Show. I'm Thomas Frank Carr. That is Greg Pickle, not Jim Galante, who you normally see in here at this time on Wednesdays. And we're making some changes here on the BWI Live Show to be live. I want to thank Jim and KSN for allowing us to share that content. You can still check me out on that show every Wednesday on the Keystone Sports Network, but we wanted the opportunity to talk to you more here on the YouTube channel and give you some more opportunities to interact with us. But we're going to keep the format kind of the same. Normally, I'm the host of the show, and our experts who are excellent at what they do and what they know, they are the stars of the show. We're going to keep that similar vibe of where Jim would be the host and I would have a little more of, I get to be in the side seat and have a little more fun than when directing traffic and talking to you in the chat and the comments. And Greg is our expert host who used to host the recruiting show. So he's agreed to join me here on this Wednesday show, switch things up, and give us the opportunity, like I said, to interact with you more here on the live show. So hopefully over the next couple of weeks, we've trained people to know that the Wednesday show isn't live, and that's not true anymore. So hopefully tell your friends, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 3 days a week, pretty much until infinity, we're going to be here live talking to you at 10 a.m. Greg, appreciate you doing this and allowing us to have this opportunity for more high-quality conversation about Penn State football here on the show.
Excited to get going, T. Frank. We have a lot to get into today, and I feel like that's going to be a theme of Wednesday moving forward.
Yeah, for sure, because just when you think, okay, what are we talking about today? And we're going to be featuring something that I talked about earlier this month, but I feel like after watching a lot of the film of these receivers that Marques Hagans is recruiting, I have a very firm idea of what he wants in a football player. So it's a little recruiting-centric. It's a little football-centric. It's going to be whatever on the Wednesday show. Our Tuesday show, that's our football show. Thursday show is our recruiting show, and this show is whatever comes up. And a lot of stuff tends to come up in between the 2 days because there's never an end to Penn State football news. Let's actually start with that, and let's start with the news of today. Jordan Hill officially a part of the Penn State staff. And I know this is something that you have been following and reported over at BlueWadeIllustrated.com. I think it was last week when you got word of this news.
Yeah, I believe it was Monday we were able to finally put something together. But yeah, either way, Jordan Hill, the Penn State letterman, all Big Ten pick in 2012, Super Bowl champion, most recently head coach at Trinity High School in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania, is joining the Nittany Lions in a new role. He is going to be the Director of Life Skills on James Franklin's staff, which is a position that Penn State did not have before. And if you listen to this week's wrestling show, we talked about the idea that Penn State wrestling hiring an NIL director is a new role, but really it's just a sort of reorganizing of previous people's roles. And I think that's kind of applicable to this situation here with Jordan. So Jordan has a background as a football player, obviously, as a coach, as a, in the finance world. He spent some time there, both part of his time at Trinity and also prior to that in the private sector. So he's going to do a little bit of everything. If you look at the, exact job posting, it talks a lot about attend NIL meetings, assistant duties for recruiting, work individually with players to identify internship interest, assist with academic check-ins, things of that nature. So really, he's going to be a jack of all trades for off-field things. And there's certainly many people in the Penn State football program who will continue and long have played a role in that regard. But you're kind of centralizing it all into one place with him. So I think it's a really interesting hire. His background is so unique and widespread, T. Frank, that I feel like even if I look and those few things I just read off, you could probably add, just because of his experience alone, another like 10 lines to that list if you wanted to. So I think it's a really interesting hire. He's now the 16th former Nittany Lion football player to be on either James Franklin's staff or a current member of Penn State athletics in some way, shape, or form. So it continues that trend, and certainly I think Jordan's excited about it, Penn State football is excited about it, and fans should be as well.
Director of all of the things, all of the other stuff. And right. It sounds like, just as you kind of described it, people are going to go to him and he's going to handle coordination of all of those things. But a lot of people are going to be a part of, I don't want to call it staff, but the people who interact with different support structure from NIL and finance and all that stuff. I'm just curious of the size of the staff and the way it's kind of growing tendrils. Not to say that it's unnecessary or that it's unimportant, just curious as to how this affects kind of the core coaches, and taking some of those responsibilities maybe off their plates. Does this kind of free guys up to be the receivers coach and the defensive line coach? And is that kind of the goal of some of these support staff roles, or what's going on here with some of these hires on these things that we've never had before in college football or college basketball or wrestling?
Yeah, there's an aspect of that for sure. I mean, I think if you've read both the reporting at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, the conversation, especially Nate has had here on the YouTube channel or the podcast feed, and then just read nationally across college football, T. Frank, there's just so many coaches speaking either publicly or in anonymous ways that say that, they don't have as much time at the college level to be an actual position coach, to be an actual coordinator. Coordinator's not as impacted as much by all this different stuff as the position coaches, but yeah, anytime you can maybe shuffle either one or two things off the assistant coach's plate and give that person more time to do whatever it is related to on-field stuff, it's a good thing. And I think a lot of the roles, either the reorganizing of staff or the addition of staff, goes a long way in that regard. And there's a reason these staffs keep getting bigger and bigger. I'm not looking at the comments at this very second in time. I'll flip over to that tab in a sec, but I'm sure somebody just can't understand why more and more staff keep being hired. And it's just
Honestly,
where we are in college
they
athletics.
Just want Nate.
Yes.
Most of the comments are just add Nate or Ryan to the show. So that's been the conversation so far.
Right. All good. We will get through it.
Yeah.
So ultimately, that's to button up that though. That's kind of the idea here. Is it the more staff you have, the more hands you have helping with different things, and you take what you can get when you can get it in that way, and that's just where college athletics are in 2024.
Yeah, there's so many things to keep up with, and I'm always relieved that you and Nate and Ryan and Fitz are on the staff. That for one person to follow all this stuff is impossible. Unless you're going to the best news source for Penn State information there is, and that's BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. If you want more from Nate, David K., who's in the chat talking about that, subscribe to Blue White Illustrated 2 months for $1. Use the promo code PSU1. I talk to you about this every single show because we get into a lot of this stuff. Today's show is based essentially off of an article I did 2 weeks ago, which you would have gotten some of this information. We're going to get a deeper dive into some of the context and some of the things I've learned since then, but you would have gotten this week, May 15th, I wrote this. I had this thought. So this is an evolution of that 2 weeks later. You get all that stuff, BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. That's the good stuff to go sign up there, including the article I want to feature here today before we get into the other stuff, which includes Tyseer Denmark and a Big 33 recap, is another thing from Greg, your running back article over where you previewed the upcoming season, 3 questions. How did you come up with the 3 questions, and tell people what they can go read over there?
Yeah, so basically just looking at each position group heading into the summer, what's the most pressing question facing each of them? We started with the quarterbacks. We put the running backs up. The receivers will be up later this week. But when it comes to the running backs, T. Frank, I think that clearly there's a top pecking order. We all know that with Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton. But one of the questions I kind of focused on here is just how is Andy Koldenecki going to use these guys in ways they have not been used yet at Penn State? And let's not take anything away from previous offensive coordinator Mike Yurcich. You can have your gripes with him, but certainly these guys have been very productive during their first 2 seasons at Penn State. But when you talk about Koldenecki, and whether that's with other coaches, whether that's here on the channel, whether that's with fans and what have you, players, everyone just raves about how creative the guy is and how many ways he can use different positions in different ways in his offense to confuse defenses. So to me, specifically in the passing game, but just in general, how can he unlock even more from these 2 guys who, as we talked about, have clearly accomplished a lot already? So that's one of the questions to me entering summer for these guys. And then, beyond that, what does that third running back role look like in Andy Koldenecki's offense? We've seen, obviously, last year, Trey Potts be a big part of that. Other guys in the past have been in that third running back role behind Nick Singleton, and Kaytron Allen, and it's looked different in each season.
I like that, though. Nick Allen, let's just smash them together and have we can't not mention them together, so we might as well just make them one name.
Yeah, but what does that look like with Cam Wallace? What can he add to this? Can Quentin Martin, of course, the freshman, have some sort of role? So just a really fascinating position group, because there's no question that we know a lot about it at the top, but the pieces behind it, and then how those guys at the top can be used differently, certainly are some of the things on my mind heading into the summer.
Yeah, it's maybe the most important position group on the team in terms of the success and failure of the offense, and therefore the balance that the team has. A lot of that is going to be the explosive plays are coming from the run game. That's a for sure. And then how many they can get out of the passing game, and that's kind of Andy Cole, Nicky's specialty, but they have to have that from those guys. So it's a really important position, and I encourage everybody to go check it out at bluewhiteillustrated.com. Okay, we're going to figure this out, Greg, in terms of like back and forth, but take it away. I'm going to do my best to sit on my hands and let you run the show now.
Yeah, so we'll roll now into a recap of the Big 33. Team Pennsylvania victorious again over Team Maryland Sunday at Cumberland Valley High School. I thought, just real quick before we get into some of the players, I'm not sure if anyone watching, I'm sure you did, T. Frank, but, was following along. But I thought it was a nice crowd, nice turnout for that event. Certainly the people who run it now are doing as much as they can to make it a point on the calendar again that people remember, people know, and people and players want to be a part of. So let's start with Kenny Wosley in terms of what you saw from him during this contest. Certainly these all-star games, as we know, whether it's the Big 33, T. Frank, or Under Armour, or the All-American Bowl, sometimes guys have more opportunity to shine than others based on the position they play and think which side of the ball they're on even. But your initial impressions of him?
Well, it was good to see a couple of things from, and we'll get into this with the theme here, to see guys in new positions that we didn't really see them as much in their high school offense or defense. And the main thing, I got to see Kenny Wosley play outside corner and see him play some man coverage. And, I can't say that once he committed, I didn't pay close attention to his senior season, because once we get into that tape, we're already into the Penn State football year and things kind of, slide by. But it was my first opportunity to see him in a while and see him play that outside corner, and I think that he looked good. The problem is he always has looked good in terms of he's a smart player. He's a team player, so like he was on punt return gunner in an all-star game. He was, doing a lot of little things for the defense, and I thought just generally he showed the same great awareness and smarts from a cornerback to break on balls, to recognize screens, and the problem was he didn't get as many opportunities at the football because, no disrespect, but the Maryland quarterback was not accurate in that game. That's just a fact that you go.
And that's a fact of most all-star games too, right?
Right. Yeah, and especially with the Big 33 the way it is now, with some of the top prospects not playing in the game. Right. Penn State, as you mentioned, smacked Maryland in this game, and the competitive juices by the second half were over. But I think we still got to see a good update on Kenny Wosley and what he is. And I don't know if he's going to be an outside corner for Penn State, but it was good to see that he can do those things and play in not just man coverage, but in off coverage. And he had one really good play on 3rd and 10 where they ran essentially a triple pick, where they ran his receiver across the field on a shallow drag, and then 3 receivers from the other side, 2 receivers and a tight end, made a wall. And he was able to run around it and still get to the tackle to prevent a 3rd down conversion on a pretty specific play. And that won't show up in college too many times, but he didn't run into anybody, and a great awareness of what happened on that play to then get a stop, and then that led to a 4th down that they didn't convert, and then the Pennsylvania team was rolling after that. So I thought it was a really good, even in a limited sense, Fitz was right when we talked about this yesterday during his recruiting update, which you can check out on yesterday's show. He didn't have a whole lot to do after that because he was targeted a couple times and the ball was out of bounds instead of like on target to see how he would make a play in that contested catch situation.
Yeah, all-star games are fascinating. I'm sure you guys have had this conversation back during the Under Armour and All-American Bowl setting, but it's just interesting, no matter what kind of level it is, if it's the highest level all-star game or something else, they all have their similarities, and sometimes that can make it hard to draw full-on conclusions. But let's keep rolling along here. The receiver everyone wants to talk about is Tyseer Denmark. We'll get to him in a second, but let's hit Aaron Enderline first. If you're unaware, walk-on Penn State prospect from Manheim Central, played in this game. Really interesting background for him, T. Frank. Really interesting high school career. A very good walk-on get, in my opinion. And he played in the Big 33 and I think showed pretty well for himself.
Yeah, and it's interesting. This is going to get into something that we see later in our conversation. That's why I wanted to bring him up. Decent speed. I thought that there was some. At first, he came out hot and had 2 really good catches. And then the more I was watching him and his get off the line of scrimmage through press and the guys grabbing him, despite being 6'3", kind of struggled with some of those things. But the building blocks are all there for a good receiver who could even eventually see playing time at Penn State if things break his way and they don't recruit so far over, his talent threshold that it becomes unrealistic. But he's got, big-bodied guy, runs fast in a straight line. I think a lot of the things it needs to work on are, those little things of being a good wide receiver, but the really good hands. And in 2 contested catch situations, went up on a go route, caught the ball, came down inbounds with 2 feet. So, again, just going to echo what Fitz said yesterday. A really good, and what you just said, a good walk-on get for Penn State at that receiver room, which needs to find talent in any place that it can. I don't think it's dire to the point that walk-ons have to contribute, but, you like to have a guy who is big, physical, fast, and can, be a special teams guy for you if he doesn't see time on the field. So I think a really good get for Penn State, and just kind of agreeing with what you guys have said about him.
All right, let's move on to the receiver prospect that most are aware of, waiting to get him to campus, Tyseer Denmark from the Philadelphia area, very good member of the class of 2024. Not yet on campus. Penn State hoping, of course, that he gets here sooner rather than later, but wasn't able to enroll early. So a part of that group of guys still waiting to get to campus. Kenny Wosley, of course, among that group at this second in time as well, based on the way the academic calendar works. But, Denmark, I think, as the summer goes on, T. Frank, be curious to get your thoughts on this, but as the summer goes on, I think there's going to be more and more excitement about him possibly being a part of the rotation for this Penn State receivers room in 2024. How much of that is based on just the idea of new and, new being, the unknown being better than the known in some cases, and how much of that is, in your mind, the realistic opportunity he could have to see the field this year?
Yeah, I think part of it is he's a consensus 3-star at this point, but he started out as a 4-star Pennsylvania guy from Philly. He checked all the boxes for Penn State fans of what they really wanted in a receiver prospect, which is a guy that was committed to Oregon. So you have this first impression of this guy is an elite guy. And we are really slow to come off of those thoughts generally, like as a community. There's going to be a lot of generalization today, by the way. So we got to understand, like, these are going to be general things that I'm saying. But, the problem is I was encouraged by what he did in this game, kind of like Kenny Wosley, in terms of seeing new things that I hadn't seen from him before. The main thing I took away is he played on the outside. He played almost purely in the slotted Imatep. So he got to play the Z, which is the field receiver to the long side of the field on the outside. And for the most part, for the first part of the game, that which, again, was kind of competitive, he was going up against Kevin Humes, a Maryland defensive back commit. So this is not a guy going to Temple or going to another lower, maybe FCS school. A guy that he could realistically see in the Big Ten down the road. And as you know from the stat line, and I'll throw up the highlights here, he cooked him in this game in contested catch situations. So a guy who's 5'10", a little bit undersized. I thought these were really good signs that he could eventually play on the outside, and I have been pegging him as a slot-only guy with some of his physical dimensions and his play style. Now, was this a pull on the back of his jersey? Was this OPI? Maybe, but again, this goes into Tyseer Denmark's a good receiver who knows how to do those subtle things to get position that the ref isn't going to call. He grabbed him in the back, low back of the pads and came down with the football. And then you can see here, great body control in the air, high points the football, really good hands. So maybe he's not only a slot-only guy. Maybe he can play that Z position. Maybe he can be a guy that is more diverse than I have been saying. Now, again, it is the Big 33 game. It is an all-star game, so we don't want to extrapolate too much. but I am encouraged. So I'm going to leave the door more open in the future to him playing on the outside, because he proved, in those situations that he can make plays above the rim. And he is more than just a guy who separates in short areas and is really quick and elusive at the line of scrimmage. He didn't get touched a whole lot at the line of scrimmage. There weren't a lot of guys who were physical with him to prevent him from getting into his route. But I think part of that is because he's so good. His release packages off the line are, if you miss on him, he's gone. But the downside, and I'll just throw in the downside here, is that the reason those contested catches were contested catches is because, as Fitz says, he runs in the 4.6s, so he's 5'10", and he's not a burner. So that's just kind of throwing kind of a cloudy profile out there, which I think is one of the reasons why Tyseer Denmark is a 3-star, is where he is. But there are the tools there for him to outperform that and maybe be a version of the guy Penn State fans want him to be based on his early recruiting profile, because guys do get faster. He can get faster, but what is the upper end of that is going to determine a lot of this. I just think his skill sets are a little better, more well-rounded than I thought previously watching him in high school in his offense as a junior.
Yeah, I should have noted this off the top, but it's a good segue. He was the MVP of the game, and it goes to, I think a point of, regardless of what you think of the competition of the Big 33 or just all-star games in general, all you can do is be the best as you possibly can be, and he was in this game. So I think there's something to be said for that. We'll see what happens when he gets to Penn State. But yeah, ultimately, I do think we're going to hear, for some of the reasons you just mentioned, more about him, whether it's actual buzz or just, again, the new factor to it. We'll have to wait and see. But certainly a guy that after that performance, I think everyone asked Sean about him and Ryan probably like 10 times a week. Obviously, with me being more on the team side and recruiting side, his name does not come up in my world as much. But certainly over the last couple of days since that Big 33 game, I've been asked by more than a few people who maybe don't follow recruiting as closely about him and what he could bring to Penn State. So we'll see how that all plays out, T. Frank. But without question, a guy that is going to get a little bit of hype around his name, I think, here in the months ahead.
Yeah, and one last thing about him that I think is important is he's got an edge to him. You saw that the contested catch that we put up, he's staring down the corner on his way to the end zone. I don't always love that in terms of, I just, the competitive, I don't want to say unwritten rules. I don't want to say a bunch of cliched things, but it's just, it doesn't always look good when you do things to show up your opponent. But at the same time, Penn State needs a little more aggressive, that ball is mine, and to let people know about it. They need more of that in the room. So can he provide a little more of that confidence, swagger, whatever you want to call it, to bring the best out of the room? I think it, in terms of how his personality fits, maybe that's also a benefit for the team. That is one of those off the field bonuses. It could go the other way. Sure, if you're showing up teams and players on your own team and getting fights in practice and being a distraction, that's also a thing. But you want to have a guy who knows the ball is his and goes and gets it. And I saw a lot of that from Denmark, which is something that I think is super encouraging. And you're just fanning the flames here, Greg. Just absolutely stoking the fire of Tyseer Denmark playing as a freshman at this point.
Yeah, well, I think I'm probably not alone in that. And again, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. But, certainly that performance was eye-opening to many. But so I also, to your point, lots to work on once he gets to campus, just like any freshman. And when you aren't here for spring practice, there's a reason we see those spring enrollee numbers rise over the last handful of years. And it's because of the advantage you get being here in the spring. So time will tell on that front, T. Frank. But without question, good Big 33 for him, good Big 33 for Penn State. And it's another milestone down on the offseason calendar to, point out the fact that May is just about over. June is nearly here. It's going to get hot on the recruiting trail. Certainly Penn State fans will be focused, as they always are, on all positions, but receiver recruiting is maybe the most talked about, outside of quarterback recruiting, which always leads the way. Receiver recruiting, especially over the last couple of years for Penn State, might just be the most talked about aspect of
Oh, yeah.
recruiting in the James Franklin era. So let's roll into that. As you mentioned, you've written about this already at bluewhiteillustrated.com. Just the kind of differences and similarities between what Penn State has been looking for at the receiver position over its last two receiver coaches, and obviously now two offensive coordinators. We're still learning, of course, what Andy Kotelnicki prefers, and really kind of to some extent Marques Hagans, since he's only through one cycle. But
Yeah.
I guess let's start the bidding with Taylor Stubblefield, the previous Penn State receivers coach, and what you have learned about what he was looking for and maybe why that was the case.
So let's acknowledge a couple of those things you just discussed in terms of the variables that we're just not going to account for today, because that's just, there's too many. You can't go into the weeds that much in terms of they wanted guys they didn't get previously. So a lot of this conversation could be that Marques Hagans is a better recruiter. But even then, they're not going to get all of their top guys in this class. So this is the discussion on, when push comes to shove, what are the things you value and you will sacrifice other stuff so that you have, I need this in a guy so I can teach him how to be a good wide receiver and it fits the style that I coach to. So that is where, to understand where we are and why it is, I think, such a difference. I've seen a stark difference between Taylor Stubblefield and Marques Hagans is because they are a different profile. So if we go through, and again, this is where you can check it on the article. I won't put every single name up here on the class of 22, 23, and beyond. There is a certain profile in a general sense about what Taylor Stubblefield was looking for as a recruit. And generally, this is what I came up with. Speed above all else. Fast receivers. Separation skills, especially as a route runner, agility, acceleration, out of the break. Not just being able to get off the line of scrimmage, but then to dynamically separate. Medium build, a guy who can play in the slot or outside, but kind of leans more towards that Z slot body type. And a vertical deep threat. Generally an athlete first who can learn to be an elite route runner and create separation with his feet and with his speed. And that's what you look at a guy like Amari Evans, who got on the field early, guy who's super fast, has all the athletic traits you're looking for. He's 6 feet tall, not exactly a skyscraper, not small, but these receivers generally tended to look more like Taylor Stubblefield. Do you remember Taylor Stubblefield, the wide receiver, smaller guy, elite route runner, elite technician, wanted to find guys who had a similar skill set that he could impart his knowledge to? I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but it did lead to a couple of problems that Penn State's had, where they have all these guys that kind of fit the slot. Too many slot receivers, not enough guys who are on the outside who can win. And so that's generally where Penn State is on the roster now, and how Marques Hagans, that's what he has to work with generally. So guys that are better receivers than they were athletes, maybe you'd say Caden Saunders, the top guy in that group, was a really good receiver prospect with all the skills to run routes. And I think he's a better route runner than people give him credit for, based off the way his first 2 years have gone. And then a guy like Tyseer Denmark, also a part. If we split the baby here and give 50% of the credit to Taylor Stubblefield and 50% to Marques Hagans, he's a guy in this class who kind of fits both of those profiles of what we just talked about. 5'10", 185, elite route runner, elite separator, but also show that he can high point the football, go get the football. And I think that's where, if we look at 2024 kind of as this split ground, which we should always look at the first class of a guy as not necessarily purely his. He's got to work with the relationships and the commits that he's already gotten. Right. There are some things we can learn about what Marques Hagans wants based on the late portion of that class, and then especially what we've got coming up with official visits over the next couple of month or so.
Right, no doubt about that, and we'll get into that in just a second, but I think it's worth going back to what Penn State has landed here in recent classes. You go back to the class of 2022, you of course had Mekhi Flowers, started his career on defense, now playing receiver, Caden Saunders, Anthony Ivy, Amari Evans, Christian Driver, who has of course since transferred out, and Tyler Johnson. And then the class of 2023 had Carmelo Taylor. So those guys, of course, you can have a visual of what those guys look like in pads and on the field, and it goes to the point that you're making here. So certainly a profile for him. And then as we look ahead to Marques Hagans as he goes through another cycle here and Penn State gets ready to ramp up official visits, what are people supposed to know in your mind about the way he wants to operate and the kind of guys he wants to get for his receivers room?
So this is where I think having watched him coach the receivers, this is where kind of all of this started. Is going back and looking at Virginia and kind of getting an idea of the guys they recruited there. But that's circumstantial, right? Again, Penn State wants to get 5-star recruits. Virginia probably wanted to get 5-star recruits, or at very least high 4-star guys. And the pecking order, the big fish eating up all of the little fish sort of thing happens in recruiting, and you can't necessarily judge it on that. But watching him coach in practice, I noticed the drills that we got to see with him were different than the drills we got to see with Taylor Stubblefield, who was all about precision, route running, separation, counting your steps. And it's not to say that Marques Hagans doesn't do that and that I'm getting an incomplete picture. We're only watching part of practice. But what I saw was he focused on being a quarterback-friendly target. Presenting coming back downhill, presenting a big target, getting your shoulders up to prevent the DB from getting to the football, making sure that you are square when you catch the football so that you can cut in either direction and get break a tackle and get yards from a comeback or a route coming back to the quarterback. I see so much more of them working on high pointing the football, working on catching in less than ideal circumstances and situations. And so then you go into looking at these recruits. And what do I see in these recruits? Well, this is a general outline of what I've seen from the guys that are about to take official visits. Great hands. All of them, at least from their highlight film. Not just that they catch all the footballs on their highlight film. Of course they do, but they're tough catches. Vertical ability, guys that can go up above the rim. Contested catch skills in those situations, size or frame, meaning great length or great height or great strength through the catch, through routes, and they are fast enough. And I think that's a really interesting part of this conversation because James Franklin, Penn State, has always valued speed. And Marques Hagans values speed. So let's not think that he's looking for slow receivers, but you don't need to run a 4.4 in high school. The composite skills that you have in these receivers are saying you're fast enough to win at any part of the field, and you bring these other more well-rounded, I would say, tangible physical tools to the table to then succeed if that first thing doesn't work, right? The route doesn't work. You don't get open cleanly. Can you still catch the football? And Marques Hagans is a former quarterback, right? So being quarterback friendly makes a lot of sense. If he's going to view that position from that way, you want a guy who's open when he's not open. You want a guy who's going to prevent a big friendly target, somebody with a big catch radius who can do things to make the quarterback's job easier. And both guys were trying to do that, of getting a big window of separation by route running or having a big window for your ability to catch the football above the defensive back and then make it easy on the quarterback by breaking a tackle and getting 10 extra yards. All those stats, Greg, go on the quarterback stat sheet. Doesn't matter if he catches it at 5 and goes for 70 or if he catches it at 70 and falls into the end zone.
Yeah, it's a good point, and it goes back to the long-held conversation about, does the quarterback get too much credit for winning, and does he get too much flack for losing? And part of what you're talking about there is the reason that conversation has long been in place. But either way, I think, you can look in the chat, you can read the message board at Blue White Illustrated, you can listen to us talk, it doesn't really matter. Penn State needs more of those things in 2024 if it wants to get where it wants to go to, and there's just no question about it. And you look at the, just looking at the current team for a second, not so much the recruiting aspect, even though they go sort of hand in hand in the sense that the more success your receivers have, the better odds you're going to have to get the kind of players you're talking about that Penn State may have missed out on in the past. When you look at the roster, I think you feel good about Harrison Wallace if he is healthy. I think Julian Fleming is capable of doing some nice things, whether or not it's as elite as as Penn State fans might want it to be. We're gonna, time will tell on that. We have some evidence from his time at Ohio State, that can help shape that opinion. But outside of that, you have guys on this roster, some of which who were recruited by Taylor Stubblefield that we're talking about here, that have flashed at times, but never enough to make you believe going into this preseason camp that some of the things you're talking about are just going to magically appear. Now, if they do, Penn State fans are going to be really happy. And if they don't, then as we all know, there's going to be more anger and frustration about that group, as we've heard for the last year and maybe some time beyond that. So very interesting breakdown, T. Frank, of how those two position coaches sort of emphasize different things or focused on different things while also having some key traits in mind. But at the same time, you can break all of that stuff down, and there's a lot to learn from it. But at the end of the day, the key for me is Penn State just must get more consistent production out of that position, and that starts with the fundamentals. And that's what you're talking a lot about, the fundamentals, that I think in some cases set things back on some plays, T. Frank, before they even had a chance to begin.
Yeah, and this is where the ecosystem you're in also has an effect. And I guess that's where the durability of the position, not from an injury standpoint, but from maybe resilience is a better way of putting it, where things had to be right for those guys to make plays. You want to have guys that can make plays in various circumstances. And it feels like maybe these are just better recruits, and I think that is part of it. I think Marques Hagans has done a better job of getting in, or at least getting some of these guys to visit. They're not going to get most likely a Phillip Bell, who's on the official visit schedule from California, but he's interested, and that was not happening previously. So I think I can't go any further without saying, like, the offensive coordinator, the success of the quarterback, the scheme, all those things are absolutely essential to the production of these players. But are these players allowing you to call plays that you want to? Or are you pigeonholed by the specific skill sets you have and having to hide too many deficiencies instead of having more answers? And this is really, just because I made this graphic, I want to put it up here, Greg. But we've talked around this. Size is a part of this conversation. Yeah. The last couple years, watching these, and it's not always this way, it's not every single play, but in critical situations, teams can lock up Penn State's receivers and they cannot get off press coverage. And a lot of them, 6 feet, 185 pounds, 179 pounds, not big dudes. Look at the list of these guys that they have coming in for official visits. And again, I removed the names so that we don't have any star rankings. And so you can go to BlueWhiteIllustrated.com to get all the information about who these guys are. Lyric Samuel's in the class. He's almost 6'4", 170 pounds, big frame. Maybe he's not going to be Malik Mega at that size where he's 212 pounds. He might be 200 pounds maybe, but he's big. He can go up and get the football. And you look here, there's only one player who's under 6 feet tall in our official listings. And you've got 6'1", 6'3", 6'1", 6'1", 6 feet, 6'1", 6'2". So these are guys, and going in and looking at the profile, they can all play in the slot to a certain degree. All of these guys have certain route running skills or certain attributes where you could motion and bring them into the slot, or they can play on the outside. And if you're Penn State, that's the versatility you've been looking for. If a guy doesn't work out at his first spot, you said, like, all these things are general terms. So you want him to play the Z. Well, he's going to have to play the other positions, because when Dante Cephas is forced onto the field because Trey Wallace gets hurt, it's not a depth chart one-to-one thing. It's who's your next best receiver and what does he do well. These guys that are coming in for official visits seemingly have more skills to offer at different positions more regularly. And that's something that I think for Penn State fans, if they get 3 of these guys, this is going to be a good class no matter what. It's just then on that pecking order, which one of these guys are the higher level recruits and the ones that have the higher ceiling. And that's where you can go to the advanced scouting I've been doing at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. We got all the receivers are done for this week. We got some cornerbacks that are coming up. We got some defenders that are coming up, and then we're going to have the full official visit list. I'll have a link to all of them coming up on Thursday or Friday. So getting you ready for all of that stuff and understanding, I guess this is where the conversation kind of comes from, Greg, is that we've had people, I know you on the message board have been in this conversation with Penn State fans who are very frustrated and passionate about this. Marques Hagans is already on the hot seat. but I don't think anyone really understands what he's even trying to do yet. It hasn't been 2 full years that he's been on the job. And yes, you can do enough to get fired in that amount of time, but it's hard to do enough to do your job the way that you envision it in that time, because it takes recruiting classes and building up that talent level. If you can't do it through the transfer portal with NIL, as we've seen receivers are expensive, it takes time. And this is where I just want to inform fans, this is what he's trying to do, in my opinion. This is something that I think should work better as long as he's able to land some of these guys and then teach them how to get open, and importantly, they get faster to the point that they are fast enough to be all-around receivers.
Yep, and it's a double-edged sword to some degree, just to button up the final point you made there in terms of the conversation we have with each other and with fans. But on one hand, you have to admit, I think that the lack of real consistency at that receivers coach position is part of the problem that Penn State has had in its receivers room. I don't think there's any question about that. So if you're ready to fire Marques Hagans already, you're advocating for the continuation of a cycle that I think has been part of the issue for Penn State in that receivers room. And then, from there, you're right. I think you have to give the guy some time to actually get his guys in place, so to speak, and get his, personal touch on things in place. And he's also now dealing with an offensive coordinator that I'm sure, at least to some degree, is going to be asking for some different things than what Mike Yurcich wanted. So, inconsistent, or a lot of consistent change, I guess is probably a better way to put it, on that side of the ball for Penn State is a part of this conversation as well. Mm-hmm. And when you talk about recruiting, and you mentioned it earlier, and I thought it was a good point that, these established relationships that, these guys walk into, if, a coach was here for a year or 2 years and then moves on, you have to basically work with the relationships you either bring with you or that the rest of the staff has already cultivated. So just a lot of interesting angles to this whole conversation, and we can go on and on and on about it as we have throughout the offseason and really most of the last year. But, ultimately, I am not ready. I am not on the, pitchforks for Marques Hagans, camp, I guess, role, if you will, as some folks are. But I do agree that improvement is needed this year, and recruiting is a part of improvement. But you can't fix things overnight either. They went and got Fleming in the portal, and they got some guys in the latest recruiting class. And so that combined with the returners, we'll see how it all shakes out.
To me, when you're talking about Marques Hagans and his failures last year, it was, could he reach any player to motivate them to be the best possible player they could be, to do the little things? And we didn't see that from the team's top receivers. My open question, I'm not saying yes or no, my open question, because I'm not a coach, is can one person reach everybody he coaches? Or are there some guys that are just not going to buy in? And did Penn State have too many of those guys last year? That's my open question about what he is as a coach. So the personalities and the elite level coaching, where you can be a guy that can from a relationship level, and from I'm transferring this idea from my brain to yours, the learning aspect, that I think is the area where you can say he did not get the most out of his receivers last year. I want to get into the chat a little bit, Greg, because there's a couple things, and I just wanted to give Ryan a shout-out. Ryan is a regular here. He says, I believe in this new format, T. Frank. I put this up on the screen earlier. He says, welcome, Greg. Glad to hear your insights more regularly moving forward. Greg has not been a regular on the live show, so I'm glad to get him here on the show as well, Ryan. So good shout-out on that. And, of course, we got the wrestling show coming up as on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel later today, so you can get more Greg and T. Frank later. I also wanted to get to this. Michael V, I'm starting to think you're a Taylor Stubblefield burner account, because I'm playing around here, but am I wrong to say Taylor Stubblefield recruited and developed wide receivers better than Marques Hagans, is what Michael V asks. Greg, what is he basing that on in terms of recruiting and developing receivers? You went through the list of receivers that Marques Hagans recruited. None of those guys have turned into a guy. If you're basing this off of Jahan Dotson was on the roster before Taylor Stubblefield got here. So I guess I'm confused as to what receiver was. Taylor Stubblefield, I don't think was even here long enough to develop a player. Maybe you could say Parker Washington, but again, Parker Washington was a 2020 wide receiver who was a part of a class that Hagans brought in at the end, but didn't find, develop, and recruit from Texas. So what do you make of this particular conversation, this comment?
Yeah, I think first things first is that Stubblefield, when he was here, I think you give him some credit for the development of the guys you just mentioned, but certainly some of these guys came in with extremely high-level raw tools, or in some cases not raw, in some cases very well-defined tools that, there was just a little polish needed to get them where they needed to go, and I'm not sure Penn State necessarily has those kind of guys, or if they do, they haven't shown it yet on the roster. But, I mean, I think that when to answer this question, I think this is a big year for Hagans in that regard. I think it's fair to say after this year, we can have a more complete opinion on him as a recruiter once we get through this cycle, and as a talent developer once we get through the 2024 season. But yeah, I'm not ready to make a leap either way yet on that. I mean, I think you probably lean Hagans, if anything, just because the door's still open for the evaluation time that we just talked about. But ultimately, it's very interesting to me to, this almost goes back in some respect to the conversation about Tom Allen and Manny Diaz, like the way Tom Allen is going to likely be portrayed as Penn State's defensive coordinator if Penn State is not at the extremely high level. Even if it's close, if it's not there, I think Tom Allen's going to face some fan wrath that's going to be unfair just because it's a perceived drop-off, even though everyone from James Franklin on down has been very clear about the fact that one of Tom Allen's biggest challenges is going to be to keep this defense at that level. Well, if you're number 6 and not number 1, that's still pretty darn good. But I think that some will see that as a fall and blame Tom Allen for it. So, I think evaluating or comparing position coach to position coach year over year, there's certainly merit to do it, especially at this time of year. It's late May. We're looking for just about anything to talk about. So I get it. But I think the jury is still out on Hagans in terms of both sides of that equation. We know what he did at Virginia. This is a different level, though. So let's see if he can rise to that occasion this year and moving forward. But I think that above all else, that receivers room just needs consistency. I think that is the biggest key to all of this, which is why if you're a Penn State fan, in my opinion, you should be rooting for Marques Hagans to succeed, to stay in this role for at least a couple of years and try and develop, kind of a complete cycle of receivers from a school standpoint and from a class
for more
standpoint.
Than 3 years, Greg.
Right.
They have not
which
done
is hard
that
to do. It's hard to do.
For sure. But there's a difference between a guy who's here, who is the guy who went to be the West Virginia coordinator? I can't remember his name because he was
Jared
here for
Parker.
Jared Parker is here for less than a year. I thought he was a good coach, but he just got a better job. And then you've had this revolving door that has caused a lot of resetting of the position. And Eggman has this comment in the chat. Worth the follow in the live thread from Eggman. He says, OSU out-recruits everybody at wide receiver. I don't know how they do it, but that's the problem. So I do think there's a fair conversation here about Ohio State being the pace car, Alabama, some of the top schools getting all of the 5 stars. Teams that are quarterback friendly, teams that are wide receiver friendly. Texas is going to be in that conversation. USC is going to be in that conversation based on the way their offenses and their head coaches who are established offensive stars in the industry. They are going to have a leg up. Penn State was not so far behind Ohio State. They had a number 1 wide receiver for many years. The problem is they have taken a step back from that. They have not kept their own pace as opposed to catching up with these top schools. So as much as Ohio State is what you're comparing yourself to, everyone's comparing themselves to that in the Big Ten. I do think that there is a fair criticism that the recruiting at Penn State from their own standards has taken a step back. And we'll see in, what's today? Wednesday? So we've got 2 more days before the rubber hits the road, really, and then we see the results of that at the end of June and into July. So, Greg, good first show. Thought this was good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have one thought on that question there, and not just because it somewhat backs up the point I just made, but because I think first things first with Ohio State, you have to recognize, number one, the amount of high-level receivers they've produced, and that attracts high-level recruits who are more likely to turn into high-level NFL draft picks in a lot of cases. That's number one. Number two, the quarterback play has been outstanding. That's attractive to high school recruits. Number three, Brian Hartline has been the wide receivers coach at Ohio State since 2018. So when we talk about that consistency, when you pair consistency with high-level results, you are almost certainly going to consistently have high-level results. And so I think among all the other points and reasons and explanations you could make for why Ohio State has outpaced Penn State in that regard, and I think like you make a good point, Penn State, I think we forget sometimes, has had some really good receivers, just not the same. The room's not been on the same level. I don't think there's any argument to be made there.
At once.
Right.
They've never had 3 deep or 4 deep of guys that you go, okay, that's a difference-making wide receiver, or the next guy up is obvious. Jahan Dotson was not a guarantee after KJ Hamler left, and then he surprised everyone in a positive way, becoming a bona fide number one wide receiver who could win in a lot of the ways we described here with Hagans and what he's looking for in a receiver. But, 5'10" guy who in the NFL is a Z and a slot guy and kind of has a hybrid skill set. We didn't expect that out of him. And then since then, like Parker Washington was a guy who was really reliable, but at the same time, Mitchell Tinsley didn't come in and become the number one they needed. And really, they haven't had that guy since 2021 when Dotson left. And I love Parker Washington. I think he's awesome, but just the nature of his skill set, what he turned out to be after a bunch of injuries, he wasn't necessarily fast enough to be a guy who threatened every level of the field. He became that possession receiver, a plus possession receiver in the slot, and a versatile guy who could be tough, but not somebody who was a number one, which they had one guy for a long time, and now they just need to find that one guy again. Trey Wallace is the pinning your hopes on him this year, but as long as he works out, I think they'll be okay in 24.
I am completely on the same page with you, T. Frank. With him, it's obviously all about health, availability, and being able to be on the field and consistently flashing the kind of things we've seen from him at times. But, unfortunately, health has often got in the way of seeing those on a more game-to-game, week-to-week basis.
Yep. So that'll do it for us today. Now we're kind of rehashing history, and we've done that 4 or 5 times. We'll do it 4 or 5 times more as Penn State receivers continue to work this summer to get better at their craft, but we don't get to see any of that until September. And I'll tell you, Greg, I will be so relieved when we get an answer to this, good or bad, that we can maybe move the ball downfield and have a conversation that isn't stuck in neutral at this receiver position. But hopefully you learned something today about where they're trying to go, what they're trying to do with the Penn State receiver room, and what the recruits could look like, what they do look like in terms of the guys that they have on campus coming up this weekend, which again reminds me to tell you, subscribe to BlueWhiteIllustrated.com because there's going to be a ton of reaction and information that is premium content over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. You're going to get that information first and fastest on the website. We'll talk about it here on the YouTube channel Tuesday during Fitz's recruiting update. We might dabble in it next Wednesday here on this show. And then the recruiting show, which is coming up tomorrow, our reactions to all of the official visit weekend coming up on Thursday. You're going to want to get that information before then. So subscribe to the website. It's $1 for 2 months to get all this goodie and recruiting information. For Greg Pickle, I'm Thomas Frank Carr. We'll be back tomorrow with more of BWI Live.